All right, thank you to everybody that has joined us for today's WRASAP Network Quarterly Meeting. My name is Esmeralda Mandujano, and I am the California Agribility I'm with the California Agribility Program out of the University of California in Davis. Our program is responsible for hosting these network quarterly meetings for the WRASAP network. And today we will hear about baseline agricultural producer surveys, results, comparisons, and recommendations. This is a presentation from our presenters at Montana State University, and I will speak a little bit more about our presenters shortly. But I wanted to start off with a little bit of a background about what the Western Regional Agricultural Stress Assistance Program is. The mission of this program is that they're funded by the USDA NIFA, and they're funded under the USDA NIFA, the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network. It is a grant that establishes regional networks that connect agricultural producers, ranchers, farmers, farm workers, and others in agricultural related occupations with resources to assist them in times of stress. There are 4 regional programs in the United States. We work with the one in the West, which services 13 states and 4 territories. And some of the key partners for the WRASAP are the California Agribility, Washington State University Extension, University of Nevada, Reno, the Colorado Agribility Program, the National Agribility Program, Montana State University, Farm Aid, University of Idaho, Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, and several others. But these are some of the key collaborators on this program. Some of the WRASAP efforts include a clearinghouse. The goals of the clearinghouse are to create a space where farmers and farm workers can find resources. And what's happening with this clearinghouse over time is that we're adding more and more resources on there, and the resources are divided pretty clearly. They're divided by state, by type of resources. There's a lot of different ways to find resources related to farm stress and mental health resources. There's also a small grants program. In this small grants program, we have grants that can fit the goals of outreach, translation, and also professional development. Those are open quarterly, so on a quarterly basis we get grants submitted, and they're also awarded quarterly. We also have added call staff to already existing services such as the Farm Aid. And what we did was the Farm Aid is a resource that is Eastern based. It's based out of the eastern side of the country. And what we did is we added call staff to be open during Pacific Standard Time hours. And then another effort of WRASAP is to network, and for network, that is the part that we are for here today. So this WRASAP network meetings have the goal of bringing stakeholders to be able to build connections and collaborations to assist agricultural producers in times of stress, also to improve behavioral health awareness, literacy, and outcomes for agricultural producers, their families, and communities. Also, to create a space for collaborators to present their efforts and offer opportunities to pose questions and bring experiences to the table, because this really is one of the main ways that we learn from each other. This meeting is open to the public, and it is also open to external partners. So now we're going to do an icebreaker activity. We're going to invite you to join a room to get to know others in this meeting. We're all here because we're doing work with farm stress and want to help farmers and farm workers find resources to cope with stress, because we understand the value that they have in our everyday lives. So what we're going to do is we're going to be breaked into rooms of 4. And there we want to share our name, our role in our organization, what organization we work for, and what is your favorite thing about the fall. It can be fall festivals, weather, foods, holidays. It can be anything related to anything that has to do with the fall. And this will be a really good opportunity for all of us to kind of get to know each other. When we reconvene, I will ask 1 or 2 people to share about someone they met in the group. So make sure that the person is okay to share. So thank you, everybody. I hope you got to meet new people in this breakout room activity. For me, I got to meet Cole from the University of Wyoming Extension. He enjoys long walks in the forest and hot cocoa in the fall, and he has an appointment with the Ag Econ extension at his university. So that's somebody that I met, and in the interest of time, I would like to have at least one more person interested in sharing about someone that they met in the group. And of course, you can share about yourself first. Anybody interested?
Hi, Esme. This is Don McMorrin with WSU Skagit County Extension. I'd like to introduce my whole entire group because they were so amazing. We had Beatrice from North Carolina. She really liked the changing of the colors of the leaves, and she's going to go visit some of that this weekend. Then we had Thea, who's from Cal Food and Ag. She really liked that it was going to be raining in California soon. That's pretty exciting for her. And then, of course, we had Michelle Grocke from Montana State University. And Michelle is really excited about winter, and fall is kind of like the precursor to winter. So it's just really gearing her up and making her feel fabulous.
Great. And what is your favorite thing about fall, Dawn?
I really like Halloween. I have twin daughters. They're 12 years old, and they want to go as old ladies. And so I'm excited to dress up with them. I'm growing out this beard to have that old man winter look.
Great. That sounds really fun, actually. Twin
Thanks.
old ladies. That's going to be fun. I want to see that. Anybody else want to share?
I guess I would share real quick that Sylvie, who is cohort of mine at WSU Skagit, it was just the 2 of us in our room, was noting, we were talking about the change in seasons and how it's nice to have the cool weather, and she astutely noted that it really wasn't that different for her because she spent the summer in Alaska helping out with her family with fishing, so that wasn't such a change for her to come back to this.
Well, that's really fun that you actually get to see some changes in weather. Some of us don't really get to see that, especially not up there. All right, so we're going to now go on to our presenters, to the main feature of today's meeting. First, I'm going to introduce them, then we're going to continue on to their presentation. So first off, we have Dr. Michelle Grocke. She is an assistant professor in the Health and Human Development Department at Montana State University at the she's the Health and Wellness Specialist for Montana State University Extension. She received her PhD in medical anthropology in 2016 and has spent the past 10 years researching the sociocultural and behavioral determinants for non-communicable disease and subjective well-being in rural areas. Over the last 2 years, she has spearheaded the MSU Extension Farm and Ranch Stress Reduction Initiative, which seeks to uncover stressors that impact agricultural producers throughout the state and provide easily accessible resources for both stress reduction and mental wellness, in addition to being a leader for the Western Regional Agricultural Stress Program, including leading the baseline team. She has also been involved in other USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture grant programs, including responding to farmers and ranchers under stress under the big sky of Montana. Our second presenter today is going to be Dr. Alison Brennan. She is an assistant professor in the Health and Human Development Department at Montana State University, and she is the mental health specialist for MSU Extension. She received her PhD in developmental science from North Dakota State University in 2016. And some of Dr. Brennan's research interests include gardening as a mental health promotion strategy and the connection among food access, nutrition, and mental health, in addition to being the leader for one of the leaders for the Western Regional Agricultural Stress Assistance Program, including leading our outreach team and having a major role in the baseline team. She has also led grants, including the MSU Extension and rural health and safety education expansion to provide evidence-based training on opioid prevention, treatment, and recovery, a grant-sponsored program that was funded by Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So from here, I'm going to share their slides. I'm going to pass it on to them, but I need to first share their slides. I have them.
Thanks, Esme.
Right.
Yeah, while those are
It
coming.
really, yeah, it very much helps to have you doing the slides for us. I don't know about anyone else, but whenever I try to do Zoom and do my own slides, it's just, it's frustrating to be able to see people and monitor the chat. And so we appreciate that you're going to do this part for us. So I'm Alison Brennan, and Michelle and I are going to be jointly presenting today and kind of go back and forth a couple of times and present different sections. But we just want to say we're happy to be joining you all today, and good afternoon or perhaps morning for some folks out there. And so we'll be presenting today on results from our WRASAP egg producer surveys, which were an enormous collective effort. And on that note, next slide. So before we get started presenting the survey findings, we want to take a moment to recognize all of the many faculty, staff, and graduate assistants who helped with the survey design, with data collection, cleaning, and analysis, and then also the compilation of the reports. And of course, we wouldn't have anything to report if not for all of the egg producers who completed the survey. So a huge thank you to those folks as well. Next slide. So as we look at these survey results, we want you to keep in mind a couple of things. Our data collection period was approximately February to September of this year. So this is all fresh new data. Some states did launch early on in that time period and finished earlier than others. So there was a little bit of a time lag there, but just generally, this is really fresh data. And this was all completed online via Qualtrics. And one of the things that we learned about doing a survey, an online anonymous survey of this scale, was that if you're going to launch an anonymous survey to a large geographic area, especially when advertising through traditional media, definitely make sure that your institution has filtering software to combat spammers, scammers, and bots. So we did have a few issues with that, but luckily we got that all sorted out. So faculty on our baseline team did an initial cleaning of the data, and then our amazing grad assistants did another wave of cleaning just to be sure that we eliminated any falsified or nonsensical responses. And we started by creating the Montana report as a template. And then we've been posting the individual reports for the states and territories on the farmstress.us website as they've been compiled. So if you do want to look at these individual reports, you go to the farmstress.us website and you can just click on the About tab. And if you scroll down under that About tab, you'll see a section in bold, capitalized baseline and a little box, and you just click on the little box to access those state reports. And that is also where we will oh, well, thank you, Michelle. That's also where we will be putting the final report. So eventually we want to create one large overall report for the entire Western region. But today we're going to focus on a comparison of 3 states with among the highest numbers of responses. So that's Montana, Washington, and California. And as you'll see when we go through the results, I think it's useful to do this comparison because there are some areas of difference, but there are a lot of similar themes that emerge from the data. And so I think both are valuable to have those separate reports as well as that overall collective report. And with that, I will hand it off to Michelle to talk about demographics.
Thanks, Allison. So one quick note that I wanted to mention from some of the previous comments Allison had made is we did disseminate the survey entirely online on Qualtrics, but in the territories, they did print out paper copies. And so we were able to get some paper copy responses. Nearly all the responses throughout the territories came in via paper copy. But as Allison mentioned, certainly a limitation to sort of the mainland over here that we were just disseminating on an online platform. But onto the demographics, as Allison mentioned, we just wanted to paint a little bit of picture, provide you with a little bit of context as to who our survey respondents were. So you'll see here on this slide, we have the 3 states along the top, Montana, Washington, California. And on this slide, you see 3 different demographic indicators. So gender, in Montana, that was nearly split, but in Washington and California, you'll see that more men completed the survey. Marital status, we had a couple of categories. These were predetermined categories that people could choose from. Most respondents were married at the time that they filled the survey out. And then race, ethnicity, you'll see that majority white, but also we have a fair amount of Native American respondents, particularly in California, and do have some ethnic diversity as you look at that, that 3rd row in the demographic section. Next slide, please. And here are just a couple other demographic variables we thought would be interesting for all of us to note before we dive into the data. Average age. So you can see the average age in California was quite a bit lower than Montana and Washington, where it's 45, 43 respectively. And average years in agriculture is also an interesting one that we wanted to include. And when we look at the aggregate report, we'll have a larger N, so we'll be able to look at some of these results via different demographic indicators. And so this one will be, I think, quite interesting to dive deeper in. But Montana, our respondents on average have spent a lot longer time in agriculture, whereas in California, the average years in ag is 10, Washington 14, and as I said, Montana 23. We asked about education. Those were also predetermined categories, and we averaged, so the median educational attainment of respondents, you'll see that it's bachelor's degree and with some college in California, and that went everywhere from hadn't finished high school to advanced degrees past master's. So that was what those categories looked like. And lastly, we also, similarly to the average years in agriculture, we wanted to know another interesting kind of piece about the household, and it was percent of respondents with a household member that was employed off the farm or ranch. And so you'll see here in Montana, the number is actually over half of respondents, and across the board, so far, all the states that we've analyzed this for, the number one employer is, well, let's say in the education occupation. So of those that are working off farm or ranch, most of them are working in education. And you'll see that it's nearly 50%, California a little bit less. If anyone has any questions about how we asked about these demographic variables, please let us know. And we are happy to share those questions, the way we worded the questions with you. And I suppose throughout the presentation, just feel free to shoot questions into the chat box and we're happy to respond as we go. Next slide, please, Esme. All right, so diving into the data. So the first large piece of data that we were interested in was what are the stressors that ag producers are facing? And so we had a predetermined list, and this did take us quite a while. And again, thank you to that team mentioned on the second slide. And we came up with a list of potential stressors, and we asked respondents to think about those and to indicate how often the following led them to experience stress. And they were basically given 5 options to respond with: never, almost never, sometimes, fairly often, and very often. And we combined fairly often and very often. And that's how we came up with this list here. So here what you're looking at are the top 5 stressors based on that question for Montana, Washington, and California. And we've tried to do a little bit of color coding here to make it easier on your eyes, but you'll see that some of these are mentioned across the board. So first thing, financial worries. That was mentioned as the top stressor in Montana, but also it appears in the California list. Production costs appears in 2 out of 3, Montana and Washington. Lack of time appears in 2 out of 3, Montana and Washington, but the only one that appears across the board here in all three is workload. When we look at this list, we automatically look at a lot of the economic pieces that show up in these stress and stressors lists. We've got financial worries, production costs, increased labor costs over in California. Workload also mentioned financial worries. There's a couple of unique things. For example, what rose to the top in Washington was that COVID-19 didn't show up in the top ones in the other states at all. And also work-family balance. So when we look at this, we wanted to highlight the differences, but also the similarities across the stressors across these three states. The second piece on this slide, if you look at the green towards the bottom, we asked about how stressed respondents were. And in order to do that, we used a validated scale called the perceived stress scale. And it's a pretty widely used psychological instrument for measuring the perception of stress. And it asks respondents a series of 10 questions. So one is, in the last month, how often have you been upset because something that happened to you unexpectedly? Another example is, in the last month, how often have you felt nervous or stressed? So they all ask respondents to look back 30 days, and then you aggregate the responses and you can score people, basically low, medium, or high stress. And so you'll see that across these three states, most respondents were in the medium stress category, meaning they are experiencing stress. It's not to the point where it's, let's say, an emergency or really could kind of lead to mental illness, issues such of that, but it's certainly something of concern. And so here you see that the median is highest in Montana and California, but we bolded that 20% of respondents in Montana are categorized as having high stress. So that's really quite an area of concern and quite a lot of people here where my cursor is. All right, I'm gonna go to the next slide and turn it back to Allison.
I see a question in the chat here. Since the timing varied, any thoughts on whether the stressors are related to time period? And I do think they are. For example, the COVID-19 one, but also when we look at the results related to wildfires. So here in Montana, those questions, the survey responses occurred before we hit a period of time where we had a very large surge in wildfires, and they were occurring much earlier than typical in the season. And so I think had we seen people in the summertime, they probably would have identified that stressor a lot higher than they did during this time period. So I think, yes, the timing probably impacted that. So good question there. So as we're thinking about their stress levels and their specific stressors, one of the things we wanted to know about was what are the topics that they actually would want to receive some information on in order to help them manage and cope with their stress. And so the question here was, to help you manage and or cope with your stress, how interested would you be to learn about the following topics if the content was made available to you? And they were provided with a list of 17 distinct topics. And then they indicated their level of interest from very interested to not interested. And so here we're displaying for Montana, Washington, and California, what those top five topics of interest based on the responses of very interested and interested. So we collapsed across those two categories. And as you can see, financial shows up across the board. Problem solving as well shows up among all three as one of those top interests. And then Washington has a couple, relationship support is shared with California, but then support groups was one of the standalones for Washington. And then sleep was shared between Washington and California. And then interestingly, in Montana, we see retirement planning and succession planning, both of those showing up for Montana. And here we think that's likely because back to those demographics, when we look at the average age of our Montana producers and the number of years that they've been in ag compared to Washington and California, it makes sense that they would have greater interest in succession planning and retirement planning because they're older and they've been doing this longer. So it's likely to be closer on the horizon for those producers. Next slide, please. And then least popular topics. So these are the ones that had very little interest. And emerging theme here, they don't want to hear about substance use issues. So tobacco, marijuana, vaping cessation, you see that show up on all three. The same is true of alcohol and other drug cessation. So that's, I find that interesting just because we know that substance use disorders often occur at higher rates in rural areas. And we also know that anxiety, depression, various mental illnesses can contribute to the use of substances. So kind of a bit of a conundrum there. They don't want to hear about it, but it's important to talk about. And then grief also showed up among those three. And then again, we see differences in terms of the succession planning and the retirement planning. And then I see, how are you accounting for bias in the data, i.e. the average age is quite young for most of those states?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think, one thing we can do is just be very transparent about the demographics. There's other reports that can tell us sort of average age of folks in certain occupations. And if our survey is not representative of that and is, has more folks of younger age, I think the best thing is to be transparent with the demographics and just understand when we learn from the data, when we use the data to potentially tailor or create outreach projects that we're aware of that. But it's a great question. And I think in all of these, there will be biases depending on who fills out the survey, especially because we also had it online. So we tend to see younger users more familiar with Qualtrics and online platforms. So that's a great question. We certainly can do cross tabs. Great point, Tao. And we will, and we are for the aggregate data, but it's a little tricky. We decided that with the statewide reports, our N was simply too low to really, let's say, tease things out by demographic group. But for the aggregate report that we're currently working on, you will see that. You'll see stressors by age group, topics of interest by ethnicity. I mean, you'll see more detail there. So stay tuned.
Yes.
Alison, do you have more to add to those two great questions?
No, I agree that it's just really that it's important to understand this was a convenient sample. And so there are inherent limitations. And, I think the fact that these average ages are pretty young is likely related to it having been primarily online. So, and then as we talk about some of these other topics. And so Michelle is going to be presenting the information on dissemination strategies, particularly when we think about demographics and the responses to those items. Definitely true that we have to consider the ages of the people responding and also the fact that it was an online format.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, so that takes me to the information dissemination slide. So we really thought this was a very valuable question because as we noted, I mean, it's one thing to know which topics folks are interested in, but I think it's almost maybe even more valuable to know how they would like to receive that information. And so this question asked, and I'll just read it. So we're all thinking about it the same way and thinking about the topics from the previous question. So what Alison just presented, that you are interested in learning about, how would you be interested in receiving this information? And it was a predetermined list that we came up with when creating the survey. And so here, there's a couple of things worth noting. So we have two types of dissemination channels that we see across the board. The first are online self-guided classes. And so this is exciting because we do have a lot of things online with the WRASAP clearinghouse. A lot of our states have clearinghouses. So folks are interested in that online sort of self-paced way to absorb and learn about these topics. It does provide opportunity for us to put together courses that producers can kind of start and end at their time, at their leisure, when they have time. The second one is an online class with an instructor. So this is another area that we thought, after reviewing the data, would be a great area for development for us and the WRASAP team, to put together online classes where an instructor is teaching, and then they can be presented live, but also recorded for folks to watch at a later date. Those appeared across all 3 states, the top 2 in Montana, 1 and 3 in Washington, and 2 and 5 in California. Another one that shocked us a little bit here in Montana, I'm not sure about California, seems maybe a little more hip than us over here, but podcasts. Podcasts rose to the top in California, number 3 in Montana. And that is very exciting because we have the USU Ag Wellness podcast that just came out through the WRASAP project. And so we know, that is meeting this need. Lastly, we've got, as I mentioned before, the clearinghouse and the online library of resources that came out across all 3 states. So folks do want to find this information online. So again, this could be a little biased with the younger age groups, but even in Allison and my needs assessments that we've done previously in Montana, we also have learned that many older segments of the population also are gravitating towards online methods of content delivery when it comes to this topic that's often stigmatized. Printed resources being mailed to the person also came up, so that's something for us to consider, whether or not we want to use listservs and mail things, because that certainly would reach a segment of the population. We also have a couple more things in production. So we have the USU Mental Health Awareness and Advocacy online course and the USU Acceptance and Commitment Therapy online course. Those are in production, so that'll help meet those needs. And then, of course, the clearinghouses that I mentioned. Next slide, please, Esme. All right, so just as important in understanding which dissemination channels were preferred, for us was looking at those that were least preferred. And number 1 across all 3 states were religious church spiritual leaders. So whoever that person is for said respondent, those were at the bottom in terms of who they wanted to hear or how the information. And this next one was, I don't know if disheartening is the right word, but telehealth counseling was a least preferred channel in Montana and Washington. It didn't show up in California at the bottom of this list, but I think just something for us to be aware of. We do realize it could also be an issue of not having enough information about how it can help and how that works. So a little unsure there. We may need a little more information. All right, well, that gives you an idea about the least preferred channels. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Allison.
I was typing, but I'll just verbally respond to the question about having disseminated the survey during COVID-19, whether that might bias favorability for online option. That's certainly possible. I think about people continuing to feel uncomfortable with face-to-face gatherings, especially larger gatherings, and so a follow-up if and when COVID subsides, right? Like, is there a way for us to do a follow-up and find out perhaps how this differs once we're through a global pandemic? Certainly something to think about. These items on this slide were crafted to really reflect some of our planned or existing outreach efforts. And so in parentheses there, you'll see examples of that. So discussing with someone you know well at informal events, that refers to the mental wellness conversation curriculum that Michelle and I will be developing very soon in this second year of the program. And then participating in community planning sessions, that item was intended to reflect everyday democracy, which will be an effort in year 3 of Idaho, University of Idaho Extension. And talking to a peer listener, that of course is the Rural Peer Assistance Network, which is already up and rolling through Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. And Dan Vogel is leading that effort. The fourth one here, discuss with a representative of a community or health organization. To a large degree, that was intended to be reflective of promotores through UC Davis and California Agribility. And then lastly, we did also include this item, participate in online or telephone counseling or therapy. It doesn't reflect a particular planned outreach project, but we know that several states using the state level FARSAN funds have opted to implement voucher programs. I know in Colorado there's a voucher program, and here in Montana, our state Department of Ag is using some funds from the state FARSAN to do a voucher program. And so we were interested in seeing, well, how many people would utilize this resource if it existed. And so interestingly, if we're looking at the most popular, the areas of greatest interest in both Montana and Washington, the more of that informal event, the mental wellness conversation curriculum, that shows up as the area of greater interest. Talking to peer listeners came up in California, although you'll notice in California, people had a lot of interest in all of these. So it's really heartening to see that their level of interest in engaging in these kinds of initiatives pretty high, whereas here in Montana, just kind of made us a little bit sad to see such low interest regardless of the format that it was in. And so in particular, the online or telephone counseling or therapy, so much lower in Montana than in Washington or California. California community, you're right. I highlighted the wrong bullet or the wrong percentage. Correct, Lindsay. California community planning sessions. Thank you for catching my error. Yep. Yeah, so you're right. California would be more in line with that everyday democracy approach. Sorry. How did I not see that before? Whoops. So I think just as we're thinking about our WRASAP outreach and education efforts and how this is one area where I think it's really important to look at those state level results. And we will have an overall assessment of what people are interested in, but just really kind of zeroing in on within your state, what are egg producers most interested in. Next slide. Okay, sorry, there's a lot of words on this and we're getting low on time, so I'm just going to try to give a quick summary here. But essentially, we've got different stressors, but similar preferences in terms of how they want to receive information. One of the sort of nuggets, tidbits of good information is that based on that perceived stress scale, the stress level was medium on average across all 3 states. So that says that most producers who completed the survey are not at a crisis level of stress, but they do have high stress, which means this is an ideal time for providing some of that timely intervention in whatever format that might be. I'm going to skip down to the large proportion interested in WRASAP projects. Of course, we already have a lot of planned outreach and education efforts, and so it's very it definitely gives us great comfort to know that people are going to be interested in these projects that we had already planned to do. Although another important factor to consider is that this was an online survey, and so people who complete an online survey are more likely to be comfortable with those online delivery mechanisms. And then areas for development that we noticed kind of gaps that we were concerned about is that there was significant interest in online courses with an instructor. So the courses that are in the works or that exist don't have an instructor. They're online self-paced courses. So if there are any courses that do include an instructor out there that you're aware of, we would love to hear about those. Or if you're thinking of developing a program, perhaps considering how that could be, facilitated by an instructor. And then lastly, just really want to keep developing the online resources with particular emphasis on financial and economic resources to help producers, since we saw as stressors and also as topics of interest, those financial topics coming up quite frequently. And then problem solving tools and strategies. And I don't know if Brenda Freeman is on, I can't, in the participants today, but one of the tools she said that she talks about quite frequently is the SMART goals. Oh no, she's not on, but the SMART goals, utilizing that kind of a tool or framework for setting goals and assessing them. And so I think that would be one of those problem solving strategies that can be helpful. All right. With that, sorry, I talked really quickly at the end here.
It's okay, Alison. We are actually going to 2:30 just because we don't want to push that 1 hour. It's a lot to get through in 1 hour. But yeah, are there any other questions for either Michelle or Alison? I think you guys were going through this chat as we went.
Yeah, and just to sort of reiterate, if you're looking for your state report, the link was in the chat earlier, but I'll put it back in so you don't have to scroll back up. And if you don't see your state, it's because we are not finished with it yet, or the N was so low that we didn't feel it was appropriate to create a state report. So feel free to reach out to us, and I'll let you know kind of which category your state is in. But there are a lot of them already up there. And again, as Alison mentioned, our task right now is to create an aggregate report that'll come in two forms. One will be a nice infographic that visually looks like the state reports, and then we'll write a longer, more narrative form of a report for those of you that want to read about all the details. And so we'll have both of those available soon.
And everyone's going to be able to find those on the WRASAP webpage, right?
Yes, yes. Thanks, Esme.
Let me go back to. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Michelle, for your presentation today. There's a lot of things that I learned today that I think are going to be helpful for us in California.
Oh gosh, there's two questions I wanted to address. So the first one's from Chad. The name of the stress response survey, it's I can throw it into the chat box. This is a quick 2-page write-up about the perceived stress scale, so you can read more about it. There's a lot of evidence behind its usage, and so you'll find lots of papers on this, but here's kind of a short 2-pager that I'll put in. And then the second question was from Tao about problem-solving tool strategies. So what those are related to. And unfortunately, it's always hindsight, that's 2020. I wish we would have asked more questions about this, but we're not sure. We had problem solving as an option, and folks checked that, but we don't know specifically what kind of problems producers are trying to solve in their lives. So yes, that's on us, and we should have asked a follow-up, but that's, yeah, lesson learned, I suppose. So hopefully maybe a tool that would help someone in all sorts of, in either of those categories of life. Alison, do you have anything to add to either of those questions that
yeah, just again, we haven't done any of that we haven't really drilled down on the individual state reports, but we definitely can look at the crosstabs between what were those topics that they selected, and I guess what are their interest in problem solving tools or strategies does that overlap with particular topics more often than others? And yes, the qualitative, the interviews, I think, are going to be helpful with that as well.
Yeah, we didn't mention that because it wasn't really a topic of this presentation, but we also interviewed on the phone. We did phone interviews with 10 ag producers who were willing at the end of this survey in all of the states and territories. So we have a lot of data to analyze there and to code, and maybe those results will shed a little bit of light on some of these trends.
There's a question on the chat of when will you share the results for the qualitative interviews?
I don't want to overpromise, so maybe 2 months from now. And if there is a grant related need for your state to have those quicker, let us know, because we are going state by state. And so if say you are working on a proposal or thinking about, outreach project, yes or no, we can look at your state's qualitative data sooner. That's one thing we could do.
There's another question. How many states were phone interviews conducted?
All of them. Well, in our Western region. So from the map that Esme showed at the beginning, we did phone interviews on all of them, though in a couple, the responses were very low. I'd say Hawaii, unfortunately, we weren't able to, but other than that, we were able to conduct phone interviews.
There's a deep conversation going on in the chat. Yes, we're all excited about what's going to come up on those the qualitative interviews, because you can always get much more details on like what do these numbers actually mean and what are they tied to. So yes, Alice and I also love data, and then pairing the data with the programs is such a great little partnership.
Oh gosh, sorry, one more thing to add. As I was listening to Tao in the chat, I'm thinking, okay, so ethnicity and whether or not interest in getting this information from faith leaders may differ by ethnicity. That's a great question. And if you think of any other questions like that you'd like to know whether there is a correlation, just type it in the chat or email either Allison or I, and we'll make sure to look at that when we do the aggregate analysis if we haven't already. All right, I think that's all my comments.
So I'm just gonna go on to some upcoming farm stress related events that you can find on the WRASAP webpage. If you go to farmstress.us under our events tab, you will find these events that are coming up. There's a QPR training that is agricultural focused. It is scheduled for October 27th. And these QPR trainings are being done by our partners at Oregon State University, and it is a WRASAP effort. They are also going to have a Spanish training, Preguntar, Persuadir, Referir, on October 28th. So, and these are trainings with an instructor online, and it's online, but we have an instructor live on there. And then on November 17th, as part of an ongoing effort to address farm stress in rural agricultural communities, the Mountains Plain Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, along with our partners at the Colorado Agribility Project, will present supporting mental health well-being of farmers and their families, and training on suicide awareness and prevention for rural mental health counselors and rural and behavioral health providers. This will take place on November 17th from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And also, you can also find a registration link on the farmstress.us webpage under the events tab. Some other upcoming farm stress related events here in California, where the California Agribility, we will be hosting an Encuentro Virtual de Promotores, which is a virtual promotores event. It will take place on November 10th, and as part of this WRASAP event, we are going to recognize a promotor. A promotor is a community leader that is very involved. They're often not paid with an organization, but sometimes they can be an employee of an organization. So we have been doing this for a number of years, but now as part of the WRASAP efforts, We will continue to do these, and we are going to recognize a promotor. We already went through all of the voting and selection process, and it's always a humbling opportunity to get to recognize somebody that is doing a lot for farm working communities. So yes, that's going to be very exciting there. And then the next thing is that we're going to have a session on recognizing our own individual worth. This event, of course, is going to be in Spanish, and this second session, which will be presented by the Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety, one of our WRASAP partners, it has been a presentation that we have done in the past, and it's always very welcome. It creates very good connections with community members. So we're going to try it out online now. We'll see how it goes. But we're very excited about this upcoming event on November 5th. It will be online, and we're doing several things to try to bring together these promotores so that even though we're at a distance through Zoom, we're also going to feel together. One of the things that we're going to do is we're going to deliver like the little conference bags that we usually get at conferences, so that we're all sharing materials and some presentation tools that we're going to need on there. So it's an effort for us to feel closer together, even though we are apart. So this is coming up on November 5th. And registration for it is on our California Agribility webpage. Some closing comments. Again, I want to remind everybody about our small grants funding opportunity. This is a small grants funding opportunity for WRASAP partners, collaborators, and stakeholders. We invite them to apply for funding through the small grants program. The goal of this funding program is to support strategies which address agricultural stress in the Western region. The small grants are offered 4 times a year, like I said, and you can apply up to $10,000 to educate yourself or organizations to reduce agricultural related stress and or prevent agricultural suicides in your state and territory. And today, Michelle and Allison gave us a lot of suggestions of possible pilot projects that you might want to try. I know I saw a podcast at the top of the California list, and I was like, well, the small grants program might be a great opportunity to do a pilot for a podcast that is related to farm stress. So if you want to learn more about this small grant funding opportunities, you can visit our webpage, farmstress.us, on the small grants tab. Well, we also want to encourage you to join the network. Every quarter we have these meetings where we have partners present their efforts and offer opportunities to post questions and bring experiences to the table. The stakeholders build connections and collaborations to assist agricultural producers in times of stress. So we want to make this a platform for where people that are working on farm stress topics can talk to each other, and we can work off of each other's ideas. So there's no necessity to recreate the wheel. If something is already working in one state, it might be great to try it in another one. And we want you to please help us grow the network. Invite your colleagues to join our calls. And another way to learn and stay in contact with WRASAP is to join our newsletter. Sign up for our newsletter. If you go to the farmstress.us webpage and you scroll all the way to the bottom, you will see this block come up, get the latest news and updates, and you can just put your name and email on there, and you will receive our quarterly newsletter. I'm just checking the chat very quickly right now. What has been the receptivity to these QPR offerings? Are you getting good attendance? So this would be a question for our partners at Oregon State University, but my understanding is that they have been getting people to attend us because the series has continued. And I don't know if, Don, you may have some information on that. I know you've been working with Oregon State.
Yeah, we've been getting good attendance, fairly normal for us to get 20 participants in the QPR training. So if anybody is interested in that, please let us know. We'd be happy to connect you up with a provider and get that education sent out throughout the West.
Yeah, and we had somebody in our team attend one of those QPR trainings with Oregon, and it was great because they're agricultural focused. Thank you, Don.
You bet.
So just to end today, I want to remind everybody that our next meeting date will be on Thursday, January 13th, 2022. So just pencil that into your calendar and you will receive more information about registration coming up. Thank you everybody for joining us today. As always, we thank you for your time, and thank you Michelle and Allison for being our presenters today. If there are any last moment questions, we can take those. Otherwise, we can adjourn for the day. Don't think we have any more questions. So thank you everybody for joining, and we'll see you on January 13, 2022. Questions?
Thank you, Esme. Great job.